Hello, everyone. It's Ryan Lizza with TELUS News. Today, I have someone who I have been very eager to talk to over the last few weeks, but frankly, for years. If you don't know the background of my guest, let me fill in some of the blanks. This is Miles Taylor. Miles was the chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security during the first during the first Trump administration. He very famously wrote an op-ed in the New York Times under anonymously, and also wrote a book um, that did not endear him to Donald Trump. When Trump came back in the second term on April 9th, Miles was targeted with one of the most extraordinary executive orders of the year, if not ever, where Trump personally attacked him and turned his life upside down. And so now Miles is out in public, doing a lot of interviews, talking about all of this. And he has an excellent Substack that I recommend subscribing to called Treason. So treason.substack.com. Miles, thanks for doing this. I know you're very busy. I've been watching your interviews with great interest and been what you've been saying has been extraordinarily compelling. So welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. I appreciate it.
So let's start with some of the history that I just laid out. Let's go back to the first Trump administration. You were chief of staff. Remind people what kind of position that was. Is it civil service? Is it a political appointee? And what you're seeing, and what brings you to the point of writing the famous op-ed that you wrote.
Yeah, well, I'd spent most of my career in the Republican Party and in various jobs. I'd worked in the Bush administration and helped stand up the Department of Homeland Security. Was in the White House in Dick Cheney's office. About as conservative as you can get. And when Donald Trump got elected, like a lot of people in the party, I was not keen in 2016 to see him, or in 2015 to see him rise through the ranks and win the nomination. I didn't think he was a Republican. In fact, he'd spent a lot of his career as a Democrat, and so folks like me were pretty active in trying to dissuade Republicans in the House and Senate from endorsing Donald Trump because we were very convinced he would lose. Of course, he didn't. He won. I didn't really have an interest in going into the administration because I didn't think Donald Trump would be the type of conservative that I was. But I was persuaded to go in by John Kelly, who was chosen to be Trump's first Homeland Security Secretary, and who I looked up to a lot. When I was in Congress, I'd gotten to know Kelly a little bit when he was the commander of U.S. Southern Command in the military, and knew him as a person of enormous integrity. And the short version is, Kelly basically said once he was in office, he came up to the Hill and he was having meetings with us. And he said, look, it's not as bad as you think inside the Trump administration. It is a lot worse. And he explained in private, views about the president's stability, the tumultuousness of what they were seeing, and a lot of fear about where the executive branch might go under his leadership. That doesn't sound like a very strong sales pitch to come work for someone. Is
What were you
hey,
doing? What were you doing immediately before that?
I was the national security advisor over on the Homeland Security Committee in the House and the policy director, and I just written Paul Ryan's national security strategy when he was speaker, and was kind of helping steer the direction of national security policy over in the Republican Party. And of course, that was all blown up by Trump winning the presidency because there was no more, what's Paul Ryan's policy? That didn't matter anymore because everything was about, Trump and what Trump's position was. And so, um, Kelly was trying to bring people in to DHS to help him run that department. And it was clear already in the first weeks of the first Trump administration that there was no department Trump was more focused on than DHS, primarily because DHS is responsible for immigration policy. Trump won on a pledge to close the border, to seal the border, and to fight illegal immigration. And so he was just so laser focused on everything DHS was doing. And that meant Kelly was on the receiving end of a lot of unlawful requests from the president. Now, in fairness to Donald Trump at the time, he never served in government. He didn't have a sense of how to operate these things. He didn't really have a sense of propriety when it came to the rule of law as a government official. But these requests were really to alarm Elliott. So he was trying to recruit people to come in, and I gave it some thought and eventually decided to go into the department with John Kelly. I took a presidential appointment, so a Trump appointed position in DHS, and then eventually became the chief of staff of the department. And basically, that role is you're helping the secretary day to day manage a 250,000 person workforce and a $60 billion budget. You're responsible for everything from preventing cyber attacks against the United States to catching foreign terrorists who want to conduct attacks to enforcing immigration law at the border. And so in those two almost 2.5 years that I was in the Trump administration, we probably, as a department leadership, spent more time with the president than any of his other departments and agencies because of how focused he was on DHS. And so whether it was in the Oval Office or the Air Force One or the White House Situation Room, we really saw Donald Trump's true colors and what he intended to do with the department. And I grew more than frustrated. I grew alarmed by what I was seeing and felt like the American people needed to know what was actually happening in the administration. And that's why I had originally spoken out.
What just give us a little bit of compare and contrast to what you saw at DHS in your time there, and remind me, Miles, how long was it between the start of the administration and you taking that job and you writing the op-ed?
Yeah. So year one of the administration, I think a lot of us felt, and I mean the president's cabinet members and then the underlings like me supporting those cabinet members, I think a lot of us felt like generally, yes, Trump's impulses were very bad. He was trying to do a lot of things that were definitionally illegal, but we were getting a lot of those bad ideas back in the box. Granted, in really unorthodox ways. I mean, you would get a phone call that the president had decided he wanted to pull out of NATO and, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the backbone of international security. And, a John Kelly would get that phone call and you would need to cancel the day because he would need to cancel meetings with the Secret Service or intelligence briefings to get to the White House as soon as humanly possible to persuade the president how dangerous it would be for Americans to pull out of NATO. But then ultimately Trump would relent and we would live to not die another day. This would happen with really great regularity. I mean, the daily management of the department was often disrupted by the president wanting to do something impetuous, something potentially unconstitutional. And so we were constantly having to get in front of him, to persuade him otherwise. So the first year, though, we felt like we were generally successful in getting those bad ideas back in the box. I wrote the anonymous opinion piece in the second year after a lot of those bad ideas started to come back with a vengeance. And one of them was family separation. Is the beginning of the Trump administration, the president had been hounding John Kelly to separate families from children at the border. And it was something that Kelly immediately bristled at and said, I'm not going to do that as a punitive measure to scare people away from coming to the United States. Not only is that wrong, it's probably illegal. And the idea died. Well, as people know, by the second year of the administration, the idea had come back to life. Trump had forced it into existence. And only by appealing to his children, Ivanka and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were we able to get him to reverse the policy. That, among many other things at the time, showed me that our thesis that we as an axis of adults, a group of unelected bureaucrats around the president, were not going to be able to keep him from doing unethical and illegal things. What's more, Ryan, the bulk of the president's cabinet, at least those officials who were running national security departments and agencies, were talking in private about how bad it was getting. So much so that a number of them were talking about the potential need to invoke the 25th Amendment. And I
Yeah.
just want to ground people in how serious that is. The 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution allows the president's cabinet, a majority vote of the president's cabinet, to essentially remove him from power if he or she is unable to discharge the duties of their office. That is extraordinary. Now, it's not like we were on the brink of this happening, but the fact that Trump's own cabinet members were worried it was getting to that point, to me, was not something we should chatter about just in private. This wasn't
Yeah.
something for us to talk about over cocktails. If it was that bad, we needed to let the American people know that Trump's own cabinet thought it was that bad. And yet no one wanted to make those statements. None of those cabinet members, even though a lot of them talked about resigning in protest or going public, it just didn't happen. And so I got to the point where I felt like, look, this is the type of thing that it's not our job to keep to ourselves. The American people are the ones who decide whether to keep a president in office or not. And so I submitted that as an opinion piece to the New York Times to share with people the turbulence that was happening inside the first Trump administration, and to let them know how bad it was, and let them make up their own minds about whether they felt like they needed to keep him in office.
And just to remind people, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, after January 6th, talked about invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office. There was an audio conversation that leaked afterwards where he discussed the idea, although he thought it would take too long. So this wasn't some fringe idea, that was discussed on the internet. This was discussed, as Miles, you point out, at the highest levels of the Trump administration in the first term, and among the most senior Republicans on the Hill. Um, Miles, tell us about the your post service life, and when did you really get in Trump's crosshairs uh, after you served as chief of staff, after the op-ed? When did that actually first happen, and what was that like?
Well, I'd written this op-ed anonymously, and first I'll say, I recognized Ryan. I was very aware of how that would likely play out. And
What
it
did
was
you
very
think? What do you
intentional.
mean? You
Well,
thought you kind of
I
saw
I
what
knew
was
that
going to
people
come?
would be immensely frustrated that someone would put a missive like that out there anonymously.
Yeah.
And I get it. I too was very frustrated that folks in the cabinet were not saying the things in public that they were saying in private. But I also knew it was highly likely to draw widespread attention to the issue itself, because no one would have the author to focus on and attack, namely the president, wouldn't be able to make it about the messenger. He would be forced to grapple with the message. And the message was that his own cabinet thought he was unstable and unfit for office, and that his impulses and his inclinations were toward illegality, that he was abusing the powers of the office of the presidency. It had that effect. That opinion piece really drove a national conversation on the subject. But at the end of the day, I knew, and I personally felt like keeping a mask on and issuing those missives was ultimately the cowardly thing to do. If I didn't eventually unmask myself, then I was just doing the thing that I was criticizing, which was hiding behind something instead of stating those opinions. And so I sort of put the marker out there and I said, look, before 2020, I need to come forward in my own name and own these words, and then explain to people in more detail the things that I'd witnessed, things that I couldn't explain in detail if I was wearing a mask and trying to disguise my identity. Now, I will say, I won't name names or throw people under the bus, but subsequent to unmasking myself and coming forward, a lot of those cabinet members in private said to me, yeah, I mean, I could have easily written those words as well. A lot of them felt like I had accurately captured the sense of what people around Donald Trump were feeling about his governance. So I came forward in 2020. I spoke out against the president and delineated the reasons a lot of us had grown alarmed. But also, more importantly, Ryan, I wanted to warn people about what I saw coming if Donald Trump was reelected, about the things that he wanted to do in a second term that he didn't feel like politically he could do in a first term. That, of course, infuriated Donald Trump. I mean, as soon as I had,
Miles, and just for people, I put both your original article and your letter unmasking
yeah.
yourself in the chat. People want to look at those links. But Miles, just quickly on that, and I don't, because I don't remember this all that well. But up until that point, were you widely were you the source of lots of speculation as the author of that article, or had you pretty much were you able to stay anonymous during those 2 years?
Incredibly, and I never thought this would happen, Ryan, because in Washington, people don't keep secrets very well. I had fully expected within days of placing the op-ed that my identity would be determined, that I would be fired from the administration, and that I would be out there more publicly speaking about my concerns about the president. That actually didn't happen. And credit to the New York Times, they kept the secret very, very well. And that gave me an opportunity, which was to talk more about, in longer form, the president's fitness for office. And so I'd written a book in that time period called A Warning, and I wrote it anonymously. And Trump, of course, at the time said, "Oh, whoever this is, they're doing this for money." It couldn't have been further from the truth. Not only did I pledge to donate the bulk of the proceeds of the book, but much later, after I had masked myself against Trump, I had to go on welfare and unemployment because the revelation had cost me my job and all sorts of professional opportunities. So not only was it not a moneymaker, it was a real money loser for me. But I felt like that was the right thing to do. Now, I don't blame anyone who left the Trump administration and published books. I mean, to my knowledge, none of them have gone and donated the proceeds. And they wrote something that people wanted to buy and read, and that's fine. I did not want the effort to expose who Donald Trump really was to be about money. And I didn't want anyone to say these accusations are not true. They're just salacious. And they're so salacious because you're trying to profit. And so I deprived them of that argument. I took away that argument by pledging to give away the bulk of the proceeds. And then I later donated it to pro-democracy organizations around the country.
Good for
Um,
you.
but and some great organizations, and ironically, I haven't talked about this publicly. One of them was Freedom House, one of them was the International Republican Institute, IRI, which is despite the name Republican in it, it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that promotes democracy abroad. A number of those groups have now since been gutted by the cuts to the foreign aid budget, and so all the more they need private philanthropy to help sustain them and to help protect freedom in autocratic countries around the world. But look, when I came forward and I said that I had written the anonymous pieces and I spoke more about Donald Trump in 2020, he was of course infuriated. And Stephanie Grisham, who had been White House comms director, later told me that she said, during those last few years of the administration, she said the president was obsessed, not just focused on finding out who Anonymous was, he was obsessed with it. She said he would
Hmm.
sit there in meetings and after people walked out, would ask questions like, do you think it was this person? Do you think it was that person? And in some ways, Ryan, I started to see how counterproductive in some ways that had actually been. Yes, I called attention to the issue, but in some ways, by wearing the anonymous mask, I had buttressed Donald Trump's narrative of this evil deep state hiding and trying to undermine him. And he used that narrative to go systematically fire the people in the cabinet that he thought were people of conscience who wanted to speak truth to power and who would defy unlawful orders. I don't mean defying lawful orders. And I always want to make that clear is, when I talked about an internal resistance in the Trump administration, I said a quiet resistance because I don't believe it's ethical, moral, or legal to defy lawful orders of a president of the United States. And that's not something we did or ever considered. What we
No
did
matter
do
who it is.
That's right. What we did do is his decline to execute orders that were illegal and try to persuade the president not to do things that were wrong. And I think that's the type of resistance that should exist in and around any president of the United States, around any party. But nonetheless, I came forward and Donald Trump accused me of treason for having expressed what was happening inside his administration. A reminder to listeners, I mean, treason is a high crime in the United States. It is punishable by death. Now, of course, legal scholars at the time said, this is insane. Taylor only engaged in First Amendment protected speech. He's not guilty of treason. But in the waning days of the presidential election in 2020, Trump went to rallies and he said things like, can you hear me back in Washington, Justice Department? I want you to prosecute this man. I mean, he was making it very clear he wanted me prosecuted for criticizing him. But then, of course, Donald Trump lost the election, was out of public office for 4 years. But we, as in me and my wife, Ryan, did suspect that if he won re-election, he would try to follow through on that threat. And he would try to prosecute me for First Amendment protected speech once back in office. And that's not what he's done.
Just quickly, because I want to, for people who don't know, explain what it's like to be called out by Donald Trump publicly, and not just called out like many journalists have been and many others, public officials have been, but for him to attack you and accuse you of treason. What's the immediate effect in your life?
Yeah.
What's the blast zone like?
The blast zone is big, and I say this without any sense of self-pity because self-pity is easily in one of the top 3 things that I loathe, but I say this because I want to be a sort of piñata for people when it comes to this situation. I want people to understand really what's going on inside when one of these things happens. So when I first came out against Donald Trump in 2020 under my own name, the quick version is doing that cost me my home, my job, the marriage I was in at the time, my personal security, and my savings. I mean, it detonated everything. And so much so that on election night 2020, I was in a safe house in Northern Virginia under armed guard and with a pistol under my pillow. None of that is an exaggeration. The death threats were so serious that I had to have an armed security detail. A guy, my lead agent, was a former Marine and a company that was started by a bunch of former ex Secret Service agents. It was that bad, and it remained that bad for a while. Had a lot of security threats. After that period, I think, as you can imagine, I didn't regret having done it. I felt like we got the end result that a lot of us who had left the administration had hoped for, which is that Donald Trump was not returned to the presidency. And I tried to
Yeah.
return to private life, went and rebuilt my life. Each of those pieces came back together. I met the love of my life. I got married. We had a baby. I started working again in the private sector in technology. And financially, we started to pick up the pieces. I will tell you that all of those things, except my wonderful marriage and family, unraveled again after the president named me in an executive order on April 9th. And not just any order, Ryan. Legal scholars tell me this is the first time in American history that a president has directed a federal investigation into one of his critics for First Amendment protected speech by executive order.
Miles, to me, it's one of the greatest abuses of power from this White House over the last few months. And sadly, that's a long list. Just remind people on April 9th what the executive order said, Miles, and tell us
Yep.
where you were when you learned about it.
Yeah, the order uh, did what a number of orders have already done. It stripped me of my security clearance. And Trump has been using that tactic against a lot of different people. And I'll tell you why that's significant, because folks like me who, our careers have been in the national security community, your security clearance is not just your ability to access sensitive information. Symbolically, it allows you to work in that community. And so when you revoke someone's security clearance, you know that you are destroying their financial prospects and their professional prospects in that industry. So that was the first thing Trump did. He also issued a parallel order against one of my former colleagues, Chris Krebs, who people may remember as the Trump official who declared that the 2020 election was actually secure, contrary to the president's assertion at the time that it was unsecure. In fact, Chris Krebs had said it was the most secure election in modern history, and he would know. He was the official charged with overseeing federal support for elections. So Trump issues these orders against both of us. It revokes both of our security clearances, but it goes further. And his order said that they would revoke clearances of individuals associated with us. Now, you can't determine that that's anything other than just purely punitive and retributive, as the White House wanted to send a signal. Not only are we going after Miles Taylor and Chris Krebs for speaking out against the president, but if you are associated with a dissenter, you too will be targeted. And that immediately created social isolation around Chris and I, as it has other people who've been targeted with those orders, because most of our friends are in the national security community. And so many of them are afraid that even by being associated with us, they could be fired. Now, is that a unfounded fear? Well, it's not, Ryan, because within days of Trump's executive order, the White House fired a senior official at the Department of Homeland Security because the individual was at my wedding, and they found a photo of him on Facebook at my wedding, and fired him, and then further humiliated him by placing the story in the Washington Post. That, I believe, was intended to send a message: is we're not just kidding about if you're associated with people the president doesn't like, we'll come after you. We will, and we will ruin your life. But the order went further than security clearances, and it directed a federal investigation into my time at the Department of Homeland Security. And it alleged that I had leaked classified information, and that I had potentially violated the Espionage Act. And of course, Trump again mentioned that what I had done is treasonous. Now, I'll make something very clear up front.
He did that
I know my national.
separately. Trump did that separately after the not within the order.
It was within the order, but he mentioned treason as he was
Sorry,
signing the order. But the
that's
order
what I mean.
itself
Yeah.
refers to violations of the Espionage Act, and all of this was, of course, crazy to me because effectively what the president of the United States was doing is he was saying, "Here is what I think Miles Taylor is guilty of." So he was issuing a conviction and then ordering his lieutenants to go find the evidence. So this is again the inverse of how the justice system works. The justice system works by if there's evidence of a crime, you're investigated, that's brought to potentially a grand jury who then charges you and then you have your time in court. Instead, the president of the United States declared what I was guilty of, and now he's asked his team, by the way, go find evidence that Miles is guilty of this crime. Um, Extraordinary, obviously disruptive to my life, to my family. We're trying to grapple with the legal consequences. But what I would say to folks is this is much, much bigger than us because already Trump's Justice Department has used that order as justification to roll back longstanding protections for journalists. And more specifically, the Attorney General cited the orders against me and Chris Krebs as part of her reason for reducing protections against journalists' homes and devices being raided. In other words, she's making it easier for the administration to go search reporters, to go find out who their sources are. This is a full frontal attack on the First Amendment. And it shows that blast radius is much beyond just the personal life of one private American citizen. This is going to have impacts that go much beyond that. And then lastly, Ryan, I would say it's my supposition now that the administration will be using these types of investigative orders much in the same way as they have executive orders against law firms and universities as a tool of intimidation. And like those orders, they only needed to put out a few of them before they could then go to those other organizations and say, if you want to avoid getting one of these orders, here's what you can do to satiate the president. And I suspect now that will be the case with individuals they want to threaten.
Two questions on that, Miles. What have you done? What has been the fallout to you personally in terms of what this alleged investigation that he called for? And then what actions, if any, have you taken with respect to this executive order? There's two questions. And the third is, do you know of any examples? We know of several, of course, when it comes to law firms that negotiated deals when they were being quietly threatened. Do you know of any individuals who are going to be targeted the way that you were, and then cut some kind of agreement?
Yeah. Well, first thing on the implications, I've been telling folks the past few days about the reality of what my family has been going through because I want people to understand that these are more than just press releases being signed by the president. I mean, they have real world impact. And I was forced to leave the job that I was in the private sector because of this. I'm the sole income earner in my household. And so my wife, who's a stay at home mother for a period of time here, has had to go back to work to make sure that we have the income to be able to support our family, to be able to feed our baby, to pay our mortgage, to do those sorts of things. And we've had to grapple with all sorts of threats. We've had threats from MAGA trolls, people who've doxed our personal information, who've shared it with, violent individuals, grotesque threats related to my wife and my baby and extended family members. And then there's the, prospect, frankly, of bankruptcy or having to sell your home to pay for legal costs. And so we had to launch a legal defense fund, which a lot of people out there have been helpful with. It's called endpresidentialrevenge.org, which is not just a legal defense fund for us, it's for others who are also targeted for retribution by this White House. And very grateful. We had an organization called Whistleblower Aid come forward to offer that up. They protected the intelligence community whistleblower during the first Trump impeachment, and so they launched this nonprofit legal defense fund. But even beyond those things, the financial impacts and the security impacts, when something like this happens, you do immediately have a sense of total social isolation. Very close friends and family members have said they need distance from us because they are concerned that this could affect them negatively. That's a really hard thing when you're going through anything difficult. I mean, imagine going through a tough divorce. You rely on your close friends and family members, and all of a sudden they are not there, or some of them aren't there because they are also afraid of being targeted by the president of the United States.
Hmm.
Um, that is a very insidious thing. And so, one of the legal steps that we have taken is just this past week, we filed a complaint to the inspector generals of the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice, a legal complaint that alleges that the administration is engaged in violations of our constitutional rights because of this executive order. Why? Because it's a very clear attempt to punish First Amendment protected speech. The president, there's no question that he issued this order in retaliation, and therefore is targeting someone for selective prosecution. And so, we hope the inspector generals will take that up. If they don't, we have a cascading series of other potential legal options we can take against the administration. But to your other question, Ryan,
But just
I think
Miles,
what
just
we
to
don't.
pause there.
Oh yeah.
So that was your first step, rather than filing a lawsuit the way that, say, Wilmer Hale or some of the other firms did on those executive orders.
Yeah, well, and look, maybe this is naive, but in normal times, this would be an option that would be available. In fact, it's the job of the inspectors general to, quote, investigate the investigators. They exist to look over the shoulder of these departments and agencies and say, are they doing things that are legal? Are they spending taxpayer dollars wisely, or are they violating, the rights of the citizens that they're supposed to protect? And so, I'm hopeful that those IGs will be able to do their jobs and that they haven't been co-opted by the president. But as we saw early in his term, he fired a number of the inspector generals, likewise to send a message that they better not turn on him or investigate his administration. So, in a sense, this is a test case to see if this guardrail of democracy still exists. It may or may not, and we're going to see. But we are prepared to take other steps if we need to. And the reason I think it's important to do that is not just to protect our family. Yes, first and foremost, I'm a father, I'm a husband. I need to protect my family. This is insane. This is, truly insane what's happening to me, that I don't even know what crime I allegedly committed. And I'm being investigated by this administration. It's bonkers stuff I never would have expected to say in the United States of America. But it goes beyond that, because whatever steps we take will influence how other people who are caught in the crosshairs defend themselves. And I will tell you, a lot of reasonable people came to us and said, just keep your heads down. Maybe Trump won't do anything. Just try to lay low and don't further
After the
expose
executive
yourself
order?
after the executive order. And I'd be lying if I said we didn't consider that, because we didn't want to be back out there.
Well, of
I
course
like being with
of
you,
course
Ryan.
you got to. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sure,
I,
I'm sure. But no, of course you got to take that seriously. You got your family and your kids, your wife and your kids to think about. So nobody
yeah.
would have criticized you if you decided, not to speak out the way that you are now. Tell us about that
Well,
decision, though.
and we ultimately, I mean, we wrestled with this for weeks. I mean, that's why you and I aren't talking on April 10th or 11th or 12th, is because for several weeks, as we sought legal counsel, which was also hard because Trump has made it very hard to find lawyers,
Yeah.
because he's threatened these law firms. Once we found legal counsel, I mean, we wrestled with, do we go out there or not? And ultimately, my wife Hannah and I decided, yeah, it probably does increase the risk that Trump wants to come after us harder. But you know what? Very few times in life do you go through something where it's so clear that someone has engaged in wrongdoing against you. And you've got the option to either sit back and take it and send a message that it's okay to be punched by a bully, or you fight back. And uh, it came down to that very, very simple analysis for us is, we don't want our daughter to grow up and say, oh, I see. The president did something to you unconstitutional and you just kind of laid low. That's wrong. That would be the wrong thing to do, the wrong message to send. And I think it would make other people vulnerable to these attacks. And so far, we have not yet seen indications that the administration is prepared to issue orders against folks other than me and Chris Krebs in this fashion. They certainly have targeted other people with broader executive orders. But I think in some ways the damage has been done because folks know when they're dealing with the president that he has this tool available to him. So even if you were Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, and Donald Trump, as he did the other day, says there's going to be a 25% tariffs on iPhones to get leverage. Well, you might think twice about standing up against the administration. Tim Cook personally could be targeted by an investigative order from the president, and so I think they're using this to gain leverage, and Trump is using this to instill fear in people he interacts with, and it works. I mean, I will say, Ryan, an example that I've been giving the past few days is that I'm doing an event in a major US city, and we had the caterers of the event back out, not because they don't support me politically, but because they were worried if they catered the fundraiser for our legal defense fund, Trump might try to deport their employees. Like, that is how far reaching these effects are right now. And to me, that's quite extraordinary. And what we are seeing in California right now is actually very much tied to this, because I
Yeah,
would suspect as this incident progresses, they might use some of these tools to investigate people from Gavin Newsom down to individual protesters.
they're threatening to arrest Gavin Newsom. And before we get to LA, because you've been writing about that and talking about that, and I want to get your views on that. But I just want to go back to the beginning of this conversation where you talked about this debate between that a lot of Republicans had about whether you go into the administration or not. And it was a very interesting debate at the time. And you had some very high profile anti Trump people publicly. I think, if I remember, Elliot Abrams even wrote about this, um, basically saying, it's your duty as an American to go in and help this guy, not fuck things up. Um, and many years later, that debate reappeared in some ways in 2025. And I understand how you answered that question the first time around. I'm sure you had people come to you with similar questions, maybe not because they've sort of purged anyone and the vetting process is so strict with loyalty tests. But how would you answer that question now for Republicans or anyone of good faith who believe there's actually a duty to serve in the government, to make sure illegal things don't happen, to try and be a force for good? If someone came to you now, a senior Hill staffer who's not fond of Donald Trump, what do you tell people like that?
Uh, look, I've got some mixed feelings about it, because I
It's not an easy
understand.
question. I realize that. Yeah,
Yeah. I understand the frustration some folks have at that thesis of the axis of adults, that there was a group of adults around the president in the first term trying to rein in his worst impulses. And I'll confess to being, one of the leading progenitors of that notion.
yeah.
It
I
was
think
it
it's
was me.
very defensible.
Yeah, they're early in that administration. There was a handful of us that started to use that terminology, and on the one hand, folks say, "Look, it's not your job to do that. Let the president be the president." On the other hand, like we talked about earlier, I think, it is the job of the people around the president to keep him from doing things that are illegal. And the best evidence of why I think that thesis is still valid is that you get a perfect side by side by looking at this second Trump administration. A lot of the things the American people are witnessing right now and that they are aghast by are the exact things the president had wanted us to do in the first term. Take California, for example. Donald Trump wanted to deploy the military domestically in his first term in a number of different situations that we felt would be not just provocative and shocking to the American people, but that we thought would be unlawful. And we talked the president out of it. Now you can
Just
see what
remind us
happens.
quickly. Just remind us quickly about give us an example or two about that, and then we can talk. And then so, that leads us
Yeah.
to what's going on in LA.
Yeah. I mean, there was one specific episode where this really came to a head in 2019, and there had been, we'd spent the better part of a year in the lead up to this incident trying to persuade the president not to invoke what's called the Insurrection Act. This is the presidential authority to basically deploy the U.S. military on U.S. soil to enforce domestic law,
Yeah,
which, you can't get too much closer to a police state than that. And there were a lot of circumstances where Trump wanted to do that, either, if there were protests or riots, or usually it was about immigration.
yeah.
And there was one particular instance in 2019, there was a migrant caravan headed towards the US border. And I'm telling you, nothing made Donald Trump more apoplectic than if he turned on the news and he saw hundreds or thousands of people marching towards the US border to claim asylum. And so in one of those incidents, we got a heads up from the White House We got a phone call over at the Department of Homeland Security, and a senior aide to the president said, "Hey, I think you guys need to get over here. The president is talking about invoking the Insurrection Act. He wants to deploy the military and fully seal the U.S. border." Okay, I'll tell you why. Even if you believe we need to crack down on illegal immigration, I'll tell you why that's wrong. Because the Insurrection Act is only supposed to be invoked in cases of invasion or rebellion. And we neither thought this was an armed foreign invasion of a foreign country nor a domestic rebellion in the United States. And therefore, our lawyers felt like, yes, it would be unlawful for the president to go send thousands of U.S. troops down there. So we rush over to the White House. The president is in the map room preparing for the State of the Union address, and he wants to insert language in there basically announcing that he's going to go do this troop deployment. I won't walk you through the whole story, but suffice to say, we spent hours going back and forth between the White House counsel's office and the president, and finally got him to understand that this would be an extraordinary escalation and that he would probably lose in the courts. But more importantly, it would send a set a really dangerous precedent for him to be personally directing U.S. law enforcement around the country. So we talked him out of it. But after that, Ryan, I had a lot of fear that in a second Trump administration, there wouldn't be people that would advise Donald Trump not to do that, and he would get his way to go deploy troops, and that it wouldn't stop at immigration enforcement at the border, that he would go into U.S. cities with U.S. troops, and it wouldn't stop at immigration enforcement in those cities, that he would potentially have the opportunity to intimidate protesters and try to enforce other U.S. laws personally, and that it would be a slippery slope into quasi-autocracy. And I warned about that extensively in 2020 and in the lead up to 2024. And this seems to be precisely what Donald Trump is now doing. He's executing the playbook that he was prevented from executing last time.
And people, I'm sure, told you you were hyperventilating and exaggerating, and he's not going to use the military. And, what's wrong with you, resistance types, talking about
Yeah.
that when you had a personal experience seeing how much he wanted to do this. I mean, two conversations I've had recently. If people want more about this, one is with Elizabeth Goitein. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, at the Brennan Center, who did an entire hour with me about Trump's assertion of emergency powers and the details around the Insurrection Act, and also a conversation with Damon Linker, who really understands the Trump world quite well and has been predicting that Trump was going to use some kind of protest, like we saw in LA, as a justification to eventually invoke the Insurrection Act. And um, look, this is one of the most predictable things out there. Anyone who's been paying attention, and you saw it firsthand, knows that this is what they've been setting up, and their promiscuous use of citing emergencies over the last 4 months was an obvious sign where this was headed. Miles, let's talk about LA and what surprises you so far, understanding Trump and his instincts in a situation like this, and what you think is coming. And I want to get your view on how you think Democrats in LA, like Karen Bass, the mayor, and Gavin Newsom, the governor, have dealt with the situation so far. And also, Miles, just let me know if you're short on time, and we didn't set an end point, so just let me know, because we could talk all day.
Yeah, yeah. I'm good at the moment. Look, I'll say, Ryan, that let me start with that last question. I think it's going to be very, very hard for the political opposition to prevent this from escalating. And that's sort of based on historical precedent. If you look at things like this being done in countries around the world where there is democratic backsliding, where there's a strongman ruler that wants to try to exert emergency powers, there's a very consistent pattern geopolitically and historically of how these things play out. Is you know when an administration exerts emergency powers, it rightfully upsets the opposition and leads to protests. And
Yep.
really, when protests happen, most of the time, any protest is usually almost totally peaceful. I say almost totally because you can kind of count on, 1% of people just to be shitheads and to do something stupid. And that applies anywhere. I mean, think about it you know, in homeroom when you were in high school or something. There's always that guy in the group that's like, I don't know, let's make a Molotov cocktail and throw it into the situation. You can almost always count on that. And so you see a lot of strongmen in foreign countries when this happens, counting on the
Yep.
violent part of the protests to use as justification for a further crackdown. And
100%.
yes, you're right, Ryan. I mean, this is what a number of us had warned about is that Trump would win. He would try to engage in very provocative action, and that he would bank on the violent elements, however small they were, giving him justification for a wider crackdown. I wrote about this in a book called Blowback that I wrote in the lead up to the 2024 election, and laid out how people like Stephen Miller in the White House were very attuned to this, and how in a second Trump administration there would be a desire to create the predicate for domestic terrorist enemies. What do I mean by that? I mean engaging in a provocative action like raids in Los Angeles, somewhat arbitrarily targeting certain segments of the migrant community, and then hoping that there will be violence, and then branding those protesters as insurrectionists or terrorists, which would then create the narrative justification to go invoke other emergency powers like counterterrorism powers, terrorist watch list, intelligence surveillance powers. And so I'm saying that because this is where I've long said this will be headed, is folks need to look a step beyond just the deployment of the US military on city streets and realize the president has a long-standing desire to go use his other national security powers, the spy powers of the presidency, against the domestic political opposition. And that sounds like a George Orwell plot, but it's based on things he actually said to us. I mean, there was a point at which he had requested that John Kelly wiretapped White House staff because he was worried that they were talking bad about him. I don't care if they're Trump's own White House staff. He doesn't have the right to go put, illegal wiretaps on American citizens, whether they work for him or not. But those were the types of things he wanted to do in a first term. And my concern is that's where this is headed, is down an even darker path. Is you'll have things like the deployment of the military. You'll have the abuse of spy powers that will be very hard to shine a light on, because what happens in the national security community is hard to shine a light on because of its inherent classified nature. And you've already heard rumors of the administration talking about suspending things like habeas corpus. We've already forgotten about that weeks after that news story, but that hasn't been done since the Civil War. And the suspension of habeas corpus basically means you can be detained and not challenge the government for why you're in jail. It doesn't get definitionally more autocratic than that. I mean, I really have a tough time thinking about how you would characterize that other than, dictatorial behavior. And yet, it's not unplausible that that is the direction we are headed.
One of the most influential people in the White House, Stephen Miller, has floated that. Um, Members of the administration who testified before Congress have essentially said that it's on the table. And most, you know, shocking, but I guess not that surprising, Republican members of Congress have endorsed the idea. And just we did a hour-long conversation on habeas corpus with Steve Vladek. If viewers want to check that out, it's sort of a masterclass and everything you need to know about that. But what you really need to know is habeas corpus, and corpus is body. It's like have the body, show the body before the judge. It's about the most fundamental due process if you are detained. Without that, it's basically what separates the United States from being a society with laws and due process, and one without that. And in any kind of normal era, all we would be talking about is the fact that the administration is floating, suspending habeas corpus. But of course, this is the Trump administration, so there are 50 crazy things a day. Um, I don't know if you're an expert on this, Miles, but some people in the chat were asking sort of the process, the insurrection in declaring the Insurrection Act, and how and technically, like, logistically, what it changes with respect to Trump's relationship uh, with the military.
Yeah. Well, look, so far the short version is using the authorities that they've invoked. The members of the National Guard and the Marines that are coming in are going to be primarily focused on protecting federal assets and employees. So the ICE officers, helping to prevent them from being attacked. But to invoke the Insurrection Act, uh, theoretically, could give the president the ability to have those troops enforce any domestic law. So if one of those protesters jaywalks across the street from one sidewalk to the other, they could be detained from the United States military, potentially outside the normal criminal justice system. Granted that would be challenged in court, but we're talking about a whole parallel system of justice that might be created via the U.S. military. And if we use the experience post 9/11 that we had with terror suspects being detained through a parallel system of justice, it could get really weird really, really fast. And I think that that's actually, I mean, my guess, and I'm not trying to sound inflammatory, is I think that is where this is headed. And I think that we are likely to see the invocation of the Insurrection Act. I think we're likely to see the president use the military to go beyond just immigration enforcement and to enforce other edicts against, especially state and local governments that are opposed to his agenda. So if they, don't agree with his edicts on LGBTQ, policies in schools, if they don't agree with this or that, I mean, he will use, the presence of U.S. troops to try to coerce those actions into fruition. That I think to me is, that's a very extraordinary development in our country. That is rule by force, and Trump did want to have effectively his own personal police force in the first presidential administration. In fact, a little known story that people didn't talk about very much is that Trump had at one point considered forming his own private military. He was sort of in awe by, Vladimir Putin's private military. That he was using these sort of quasi militia members that would go engage in conflicts on his behalf overseas, and he
Like you're talking
wanted
about, like the
something.
Wagner Group kind of thing.
Exactly, the Wagner Group. Trump was sort of envious that Putin had this Wagner Group, and at one point, I won't name the firm, but it's a very well-known private security contractor. Trump was in conversations with the founder of that private security contractor company about launching something similar and taking over the war in Afghanistan, and then potentially having his own private, military group that he could use for other things. People were really worried about this inside the administration, and Trump was ultimately dissuaded from doing something along these lines. But the conversation allegedly roared back up after I'd left the administration of Trump wanting to do this to build his own sort of private military, and it was shot down again. But I mean, he's had a long-standing concern that members of the chain of command in the military might eventually say no to him because they don't want to do something unconstitutional. I still think he has those worries about if he invoked the Insurrection Act, is the chain of command being disloyal, and that's why they have fired a lot of different folks inside the Pentagon and put what they think are loyalists in place. But I don't rule out the possibility of Trump trying to engage private military contractors, but also militia groups in the United States to go engage in some of this law enforcement activity, which is people need to be thinking that step ahead. That's another place that this could go, is there are potential authorities the president could invoke in things like the Immigration and Nationality Act and other laws that might allow him to go empower a private militia group to enforce the law. And, I don't need to say to folks how scary that is. I don't think I would trust a local militia member, marching down the street and protecting my rights. It's a pretty scary image. But it's something that was somewhat contemplated in the first term, and we could see come into reality here in the second.
I've never heard that specific story, Miles, and that's just extraordinary. It's something that is not surprising, but just to hear the details that Trump was personally envious of Vladimir Putin's use of the Wagner Group, this private military, to just sort of do his bidding. It's exactly the kind of thing you would think Trump is jealous of, but to know that as a fact is amazing. And the scenario that you just laid out is terrifying. The fact that these are things that are in the realm of possibility right now. Let me ask you about the response from both Democrats and then, more importantly, since this is the tribe you come from, Republicans. This is a very tricky situation politically, because, as you pointed out, the whole game here from Trump is to elicit a certain kind of response. What we've seen these last 4 months is attacks and targeting of institutions and people that are can be difficult to defend. Harvard's not necessarily easy to defend. White shoe law firms in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of people shedding tears for them generally, even though it's important when they come under attack to talk about it. Um, you know, an anonymous government employee like yourself, right? Government employees, federal government employees are not, there's not a huge amount of sympathy out there in the world. Journalists, forget about it. Our our approval rating is almost as bad as politicians, and of course, immigrants, undocumented or otherwise, people without resources, people waving Mexican flags in LA. It's anyone's right to wave any flag they want. Hundreds of immigrant groups across the country proudly show their flag, whether it's Irish Americans or any other group. But on TV, it's not exactly politically astute. I think you could argue. Anyway, he's pushing the Democrats into trying to over these last few months to defend things that are hard to defend. Now, of course, he's stoking this fight on immigration, the issue he won on that Democrats have been wrestling with. You have a governor of California who is actually trying to move and moderate the Democratic Party on that issue of immigration. But suddenly this situation falls into his lap. And the whole game here is for Democrats to do stupid things that look bad on TV, get on the side of violent protesters, and tie them to as you pointed out, what is often the 1% of protesters that are doing stupid shit. And so Newsom and Bass this has not been easy. Trump wants to inflame this situation. Violence pays dividends to him because he wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. That's a pre-existing desire he has. How do you assess how Democrats have dealt with this so far, especially in California? And what advice, given what you kind of you have a real sense of seeing around the corners of what Trump wants here. So I think it would be great to hear from you about what advice you would give Democrats and to assess how they've done so far.
Well, I think folks aren't going to want to hear it from me. I obviously think what we're witnessing from this administration is alarming for America's future and the threat to democracy and the stability of the republic. But I also am not terribly optimistic about how Democrats will handle this situation. I think it's very easy to bait the political opposition into doing the things that you just said, Ryan, is getting them to defend the things that might not appeal to, moderate, middle of the road Americans. But what's more than that, the violence piece is really what I key in on, because that really is how this all gets moving for them. Is everyone, or let's call it 99% of Americans, are opposed to violence in their streets. No one wants to see violence in their streets. And so if they can get these groups, even a fringe element, to be violent, it really puts the wind in their sails. And I think, there's only so much a Gavin Newsom or a Karen Bass can do to prevent, protests from becoming violent, especially if the administration engages in provocative action like stationing United States Marines in your neighborhood. Of course, that's going to be provocative. Of course, that's going to anger people. And of course, there's going to be the guy or gal that says, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to throw rocks at them. That gives the administration, at least in their mind, the narrative to respond. And remember, when we had protests in the first term and people were throwing rocks, Donald Trump said, if they throw rocks, we'll use rifles. I remember that because we had to call the White House and say, can we get Jim Mattis on the phone too to tell the president that the rules of engagement do not include shooting protesters if if they're throwing rocks. But I'm telling you, that's the type of thing he wants to do. Is he wants to have the justification to go out there and use violent force to assert more control. And I suspect that is what will happen. I think they'll have a hard time containing the more violent elements of protest. So my advice would be what Gavin Newsom's advice was at the end of his address is, people, not just people who are engaged in the protests, people who are friends with people engaged in the protests, everyone needs to really make the mantra peaceful, 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 peaceful protest, because the moment it doesn't become peaceful, gives the administration exactly what they are looking for to engage in a further crackdown. Like I said, I'm not terribly optimistic that that will happen. I do think Stephen Miller and Trump have the advantage here. And that means we also need to be prepared for what that looks like come 2026, because there's a real possibility, if you're looking around the corner here, that Trump will try to use military deployments to suppress the vote in 2026. It's something that he and others are very aware of. We saw this in Arizona, for instance, in 2024, as militia groups showing up at the polls as a way to deter people on the political left from coming to those polling locations. They're aware that that's a really insidious and effective voter suppression tactic. And Trump, more than anything, is afraid for his freedom at the back end of the presidency. Will he be held accountable for any of the things that happen? Now, put aside presidential immunity and Supreme Court decisions, he doesn't want to have people investigating him. And if the Democrats win the House in 2026, Trump has got a full-time, body of Congress that is issuing subpoenas, that has a comms platform, and he knows how significant that is. And I can see these efforts that are happening this year slowly building towards something that you see in 2026, which of course will be bubble wrapped, Ryan, in legalese, because they will say, we are deploying the National Guard to polling locations to protect the polls. Things are getting too violent in our cities. We need men with guns at the polls to protect you when you're voting. But that is likely to have a dampening effect on turnout, especially in areas where the administration doesn't want to see Democrats regain the advantage. That is a place where this could go. I'm not saying it will go there, but that is certainly a place it could go. And the timing of all of these things is not coincidental. I mean, this weekend, the President of the United States will have a military parade in the nation's capital on his birthday. And he will be able to point to the use of force in a major U.S. state where he says there are lawbreakers he's bringing under control. Those two things are not coincidental. I firmly believe that they had timed this provocation for the president to be able to talk about how he is restoring law and order with the U.S. military. So, where this goes next, I think folks' imaginations can probably point them the right direction.
I'm in here in Washington. Tanks are rolling into this city and have been over the last few days as we speak. I wish, Miles, I could say that you are hyperventilating, that you are exaggerating, that you are painting a picture that would never happen in America. But I can't, and I think people need to listen clearly to the worst outcome scenarios that you are pointing to, because everything that we witnessed over the last 4 or 5 months has been pointing in this direction. I want to end on this. I just, as always with Trump's abuses of power, if a few Republicans spoke up, it could have a moderating effect. A lot of people tune out. Even Gavin Newsom, they tune out Democrats when they're criticizing. They tune out people who are defined as critics of Trump. So you were a longtime Republican. I don't know what you consider yourself these days, but just assess what you've seen from the response from Republicans, specifically on the LA situation and the sort of very dark um, uh, future that you're and potentiality that you're pointing to with the gradual escalation of and assertiveness of new presidential powers.
Well, I say this, Ryan, still as a conservative. I mean, I'm no longer a Republican because I think my party doesn't embrace conservatism, but I still consider myself ideologically vastly more conservative than Donald Trump. I mean, he's a populist that kind of goes whatever way the wind blows. I believe in very small government and a government that's not doing much more than providing basic security guarantees and enforcing contracts. So, like, I'm a hardcore libertarian still. But I don't think, in
Libertarians
fact,
are
I think
looking
this,
good these days.
they are. And I think that this administration is acting very contrary to some of those core elements of conservatism, uh, by, rather than keeping the government out of people's lives, inserting it so forcefully into their lives that you have a United States Marine on your street corner trying to enforce the law. That is anti-conservative by its very nature. I do think Republicans have been incredibly muted in this second Trump administration, but I would agree with you, Ryan, if they weren't, or if a handful were not, it could have an enormous impact. And it did in the first Trump administration. By and large, Republicans lined up behind Trump in the first administration, but the handful who dissented, the John McCains and the Mitt Romneys and the Susan Collinses, were able to have an impact. And then in the 2020 election, the Trump officials like myself and eventually the cabinet members who came forward, finally, those folks, I think, had a pretty decisive impact on the 2020 election. Why? Not because they changed the thinking of the whole Republican Party, but because a lot of Republicans around the country were given air cover if they saw another Republican on television saying, "Hey, it's okay to be a conservative and to not like the direction Donald Trump's going." And that air cover was just enough to change the direction of that election. And I think potentially, could hold this president to account in a second term if it was there. But that will require sitting Republicans to do what we just did in this conversation, Ryan, to imagine a few steps ahead of where this could go, to be alarmed enough about it that they say something, and then to actually go say something. And I'll tell you, I'll close with an anecdote here. I worry about whether that will happen because there was a there were a number of war games that happened in the lead up to this administration, bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans who got together to project where things might go in a second Trump administration. I participated in one of those, and I played the role of the Secretary of Homeland Security in the game. And basically, when the president got sworn into office, I undertook some of these actions in this fake scenario that you are seeing right now. I deployed the U.S. military in a fictional immigration scenario and invoked the Insurrection Act, and it led to this cascading crisis. And at the time, even Republicans who turn against Donald Trump, never Trump Republicans who were participating in the exercise, pulled me aside privately and said, "Hey, this is kind of disruptive. You're going straight to these outlandish scenarios. Let's focus on like the realistic tactical things they might do in the first few months of this administration so that we can be prepared." And I looked back at this group in our private virtual meeting room and I said, "Guys, I'm being as sincere as I possibly can be. This is where it's going to go. And if we're not imagining that it goes to these extremes, we will not be prepared for when it does." And I think right now, a lot of folks are being caught flat footed by the administration's willingness to go deploy the military in this fashion, how quickly some of these moves are proceeding. And if we want to avoid being caught flat footed, if we want to avoid losing our democracy, then we can't fail to imagine what might come next. And I think that it applies no more importantly uh, than it does to Republicans than anywhere else. Is we really need people within the president's party, elected members of Congress, looking a few steps ahead on the board and seeing where this can go. And deciding whether or not they want to be in a democracy like that, because it's not just Donald Trump. Eventually he will lose power. Eventually, someone from the left will be in the White House. And it could be someone from the far, far left who decides that actually the tactics Trump used, the anti-constitutional tactics he used, maybe are a useful way to enforce a different ideology. And I don't think Republicans will be too pleased with that. So
That's
that's what I hope
yeah.
happens, and and I hope we can sketch that picture so some of those folks wake up.
Yeah, that last point is something that I've been talking about for a while now. Is I just don't understand why these Republicans in Congress want a world in which in 2029 a Democrat says, "You know what? This is the way the game's played now. I'm going to completely politicize the government, weaponize it against Republicans, use the Insurrection Act to force everyone to become transgender." And drive an EV. I just don't understand how Republicans don't see that they are changing the rules, and eventually Democrats are going to say, this is the way the game's played, and we're going to exercise presidential powers in the same way. I mean, the only I suppose in the most frightening alternative is these guys think Trump's just going to be president for a lot longer than he says, but I still am not willing to believe that. Um, Miles, thank you so much. It's a brilliant conversation. The comments have been overwhelmingly positive. Thanks for speaking out, for your bravery. People can find you on Substack at treason.substack. Your last book was Blowback, and your legal defense fund is End Presidential Revenge. Let's do this again soon, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate everything you're doing. We'll talk soon.
Take care. Bye, everyone.